Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Charlie Arehart, and he's a veteran ColdFusion troubleshooter. He has been doing IT stuff for so long, we don't even want to talk about that until the second half of the show, when we will talk about how long we've been doing things and the benefits of that. But first of all, we're going to talk about unexpected load and how you can counter it, and how there may be spiders or other things you didn't even know about. In fact, could you even get to expecting unexpected load? So lots of crazy stuff there. And Charlie's going to be talking about that at CFObjective, which is coming up soon. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So welcome back to the show, Charlie.
Thank you for having me, Michael. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. Coming to us from beautiful downtown Kentucky.
Not downtown, beautiful rural
Kentucky. Rural, right, yes. You're out in the sticks. You escaped from the city.
15 minutes from a town that's got 1,500 people in it.
Goodness me.
2 hours from a city that's got, 50,000 people in it. I love it.
You're quite a way away from the
rural.
busyness.
And it's beautiful. It's beautiful here.
Of Atlanta that you used to have.
Right, Atlanta and then D.C. Growing up in D.C.
till
my 40s, and then moving to Atlanta from my 40s, and now here and working from here. And that's why we came here, because with the work that I do, it's all remote. I can connect to people. And as long as I've got a decent internet connection, I can work from here. And I'm looking out at a beautiful vista of trees and sometimes turkeys and deer and all kinds of fun stuff. So
that's amazing. It's incredible what technology has allowed people to do. And I'm sure some of the listeners are working remote as well.
Yeah.
So great.
And we can encourage others like you. I mean, you're in Peru. And so these days you can work from pretty much anywhere. Obviously, some people work for companies where they won't let them, but if you, are.
I think that's going. I think that trend is going away. Even though IBM tried to get all their remote workers to come back to the office, though all the good ones I think left.
But for those that do work independently and feel like they can work, it's just wonderful because it frees you up to consider going to places that you might have always thought nice to live elsewhere, and you don't have to, put up with the rat race. I just had, for the first time in 2 years, I've actually got a picture on my phone of my first traffic jam. There was like 6 cars in front of me, and a
6-car traffic jam
because there was like somebody doing some construction on the road, and that was the first time in 2 years I've been stopped on these roads here.
Wow.
Yeah, usually a traffic jam is a couple cars at a stop sign, and you're waiting for a tractor to pass. That's life in the country. It's wonderful.
Well, speaking of traffic jams, if your server is having an unexpected load situation and it's kind of jammed up and running slow, that could really cause some problems, I imagine.
Yes, sir. And so the title of the talk was, "Are Spiders Eating Your Server?" And when I say spiders, I don't just mean generically I don't mean specifically what people think of as spiders, as search engine spiders, for instance. But just generally, there's all kinds of stuff that sends automated traffic. And the point is, again, that it's often unexpected, the level of that traffic. I mean, it could be search engine spiders from Google and Bing and Yahoo and Baidu in China and Yandex in Russia. But it could also be your load balancer. People don't often think about this, but they'll have their load balancer, if they have one, sending requests to their server every, let's say, 5 seconds. Well, we'll talk later about what the impact of that is, because what page you call might be doing a lot more work than you think it's doing. But let's just go even further and say, even if you think you've just got your load balancer checking your server every 5 seconds, I often go digging in and find out, well, they're doing a call to HTTP and a call to HTTPS. So that's really 2 every 5 seconds. And then they'll actually be sending it to this domain and that domain. And let's just say you had 2 domains on your server. Well, the load balancer doesn't really know that those 2 domains are served, let's say by ColdFusion or Lucy or whatever you might be using. Again, this is not even unique to CFML. It could be PHP, Python, doesn't matter. But the point is the load balancer, it doesn't know. So it might be sending 4 requests every 5 seconds. And, you maybe aren't even involved in setting that up. Somebody else is, and they don't know that what is being called is your single CF or whatever application server you're running. And it's not unusual to find just load balancers alone causing potentially dozens of requests every 10 seconds.
Wow.
Yeah. And then, like I said, then there's spiders and bots, and there's spiders of all kinds. And then there's knuckleheads sending in requests trying to break into your server all the time, and all these things.
More of that happening this year.
I'm sorry.
You know,
say it again.
It seems to be more of that happening this year. The knucklehead.
Sure,
hackers.
the knuckleheads trying to break in. Sure, because they're finding out that there's also automated tools that make it so easy. I mean, I just saw something the other day about a new tool that had been discovered, and it's being sold on the black market for about $500, and it is apparently very, very, very good at quickly and easily automating the process of digging in and finding out servers that are exposed and easily broken into, and then also rating them and ranking them in terms of their value.
Wow.
So that bad guys can decide which ones do they want to go after. So yeah, we're just going to be hit by more and more of this stuff. And that's, this isn't a discussion on security and protecting against vulnerabilities. That's its own topic. But the point is that those bad guys, or script kiddies, as people refer to it, just generally people trying stuff, but sometimes really bad guys are all trying to get in. And when you look at your web server logs, or if you have a tool like Fusion Reactor and you can see it logging every request, you'll be stunned to see the rate of requests coming in that you might have presumed were legitimate traffic. I mean, that's the thing that I want people to stop and realize, is that sometimes they're judging their traffic by, let's say, certain means that they think, let's say it's logins, or let's say it's purchases, or let's say it's Google Analytics, and they think they're getting, let's just pick a number. I mean, everybody's numbers are different, but let's just say it was 10,000 requests an hour. You might get 10,000 a day. Somebody might get 10,000 a minute. Doesn't matter. The ratio is not, or the actual value is not important. But my point is, let's just say it was 10,000 an hour. And you thought that's what you're serving, and you feel good, and you've got your server properly, you think adequately sized for what you think is 10,000 requests an hour. And you're judging that, let's say, by Google Analytics. Well, something to be aware of is that Google Analytics tracking of your request is only done by the client running the JavaScript that you provide in your page. So first of all, if you don't provide that stuff in a page, Google Analytics isn't going to see that hit. But second, and as important, is that some clients aren't going to execute that JavaScript. They just want the HTML result. They're not going to run the result. They're just going to save the result. So spiders work that, search engine spiders. They're not generally interested in running your JavaScript. They just want the HTML or whatever it is you send, PDFs, Excel spreadsheets, whatever. Right. And they're going to archive that. Well, my point is they're not going to execute the JavaScript necessarily. Now, I'm not going to say that no spiders do. So I don't want people to take these as firm rules, but I'm saying just stop and think about this stuff. Is that you might find that, here's my point, is that Google Analytics may say you got, let's say, 10,000 an hour, but let's say your Fusion Reactor logs are watching, well, and let's say you could break out in that pages that are really, your, quote, web pages, not images and CSS and JS, that sort of stuff. But you might say that from some analysis, you've seen that you've got 10,000 visits per hour to your site as judged by something like Google Analytics. But if you could look at a tool that actually tracks every request, you might find out you're getting 20,000 an hour, or 50,000 an hour, or again, maybe you get 10,000 a day and it's 50,000 a day. But the point is, you might get far more traffic than you think because the tools you're using to measure it aren't watching every request. So that's where there's real value in having tools that do watch every request. Tools like the ColdFusion Server Monitor, Fusion Reactor, CFusion, those are all tools that can really show you the true requests per second being executed in your engine, whether it's ColdFusion or Lucy or Rilo, Blue Dragon. Different tools support different engines. But the point is, when you find out the traffic, you might be surprised that the rate is much higher than you thought.
It's like there's a hierarchy of server requests. There's the well-formed request from actual users, and then you've got, possibly well-formed requests from obedient spiders, and then you've got somewhat more naughty spiders who just come in and get what they can. And then you have hackers who may not even be sending a complete HTTP request. Some of these denial of service things, they deliberately send malformed requests.
Sure. And that's where you see that this can become a big subject, and more than we'll possibly be able to cover in the time we have here, and really more than I can cover adequately in the hour of the presentation. But I'll touch on these things so that people give them thought and pursue them on their own. Because even if we take out the malformed requests and just talk about what looks legitimate, my point is that you could get requests that look totally legitimate, And they might even show what's called a user agent. Some of you know that browsers identify to the server a header called the user agent, and that user agent header typically says what kind of browser it is. And spiders and bots that are good spiders and bots tend to present a user agent that is who they are. So Google has Googlebot, and Bing says Bing, and Yahoo says Slurp, and there's a bunch of other user agents. But there are some bad guys that will lie about the user agent. So they look legitimate. They look like a regular browser, and they look like a regular well-formed request. But maybe if you look closely, you'll find out, holy smokes, we're getting, let's say in a 1 minute span, 500 requests to our products page, and it's getting product ID after product ID after product ID. And that's not a real person, right? I mean, maybe, but not 500 in a minute, and you might find that either they are all from the same IP address, but let me tell you, these guys are getting so savvy, they'll often spoof the IP address, and you might see that it's 500 requests in a minute from different IP addresses. But if you look, you'll see that the pattern of the URL is always the same, and all it's varying is this product ID. Well, then, it may not be real people, despite there being different IP addresses. It may be a bad guy varying his IP address because he can tell you whatever he wants to tell you, and your server's just tracking what it's being told. But you might find there's these weird patterns of traffic, and that's people trying to grab your content and whatever. They might sell it. They might use it to build their own site to mimic what your site does. They might use it to develop intelligence against you. So we'll touch on each of these things in the course of the presentation. But it's amazing when you start to look into this, either just thinking about it or looking literally at what you're getting. You find out that there's a lot more traffic coming to your server. And you mentioned the legitimate people. Let's just back up. And one of my primary points here is that I've worked with a lot of people, because you mentioned I do troubleshooting. That's what I do for a living. I do server troubleshooting, primarily focused on CFML servers. And sometimes when I'm helping solve a problem for people, whether it's high memory or high CPU or requests taking too long or whatever they perceive to be the problem, sometimes the root of it is that we find out there is this tremendous amount of traffic that they didn't expect. And they are fighting to keep the server up and running, thinking that they're having trouble serving their legitimate, let's say they think they have, 500 users logged on at a time. I'm just throwing out random numbers. You might have 50,000 users logged on at a time. That's not the point. Whatever you think is your number of users that you're really serving, you might find out that no, you're really serving 5 times that, 10 times that. And my point is, you might be thinking, man, our box can't handle this load. ColdFusion can't handle this load. That's not the issue. It's not that either your box or your environment or ColdFusion can't handle the load. It's that you didn't realize that there's much more load than you think. And so people are often jumping through hoops to make their environment, quote, capable of handling their, quote, load. And they might go to clustered instances, multiple instances, clustered databases. I've seen people jumping through incredible hoops and spending a lot of money to do these things, when it turns out they didn't realize that a lot of their traffic was this automated traffic. And they're really not needing all that stuff for their real people. But the problem is their real people are a tiny subset of their traffic. So now what do we talk when? What do you do? That's the premise of all this, is that there is an impact. So what do you do about it? And we'll talk in the presentation about more specifics of things that, for instance, let me just throw out, if you're got a load balancer calling your front page, you might think, well, come on, I just want the load balancer to confirm that ColdFusion's up, our website's being served. That's what we got to do, right? And maybe it is. But for instance, if you just want to confirm that CF is up, no, you don't need to call your front page. You could call a little test page that just runs a single CFML line of code. And as long as it works, that tells you CF's up. But somebody will say, well, we want to test that our website responds, our application responds. Well, just keep in mind that when you call, let's say, your front page of your website, it's going to run everything that's on that page. And you CF developers, you know that what goes on is not just what goes on your page, but the application CFC or CFM, if you use those, either in that directory or in a directory above it, ColdFusion finds, and Rilo and Lucy and Blue Dragon, they all find an application CFM or CFC. Mm-hmm. Well, then in that code, you might have on session start in an application CFC, or you might have a set of code in application CFM that says, if not is defined, session, some variable, do some stuff. Well, here's my point. These calls from these automated requests, they tend to execute that session startup code on every request.
And that might be loading a whole bunch of information you want to cache for the real users, but you don't really want to be caching for these bots.
And you're overwhelming. Let's say it could be caching, or let's look at a query. I mean, you might in your session startup code do some query that you think, I'll do this query for these people up front, be a good guy, save the result, and I'll store it in a session variable. Well, that's fine for a real person. You'll do it once, and they'll reuse that over the course of their next 50 or 100 or 1,000 visits over the next hour or whatever it is your session timeout is. But the bad guys, the spiders, the bots, not even bad guys, your load balancer ping, he's not going to send any cookies. So ColdFusion is going to think that's a new session. Every request to the front page from your load balancer.
Every 5 seconds.
Every 5 seconds. And remember, it may not be just every 5 seconds. It might be 2 for HTTP and HTTPS, and then it might be 4 because you serve 2 domains and they're both on the same server. So it could be 4.
Well, and you may have some AJAX calls on the page. You know?
And you might, but those AJAX calls tend to come from your browser making the request, and then the browser tends to send the cookie with those requests. But when you think about the load balancer ping, he doesn't send in cookies. When bad guys send their crap against your server, they don't tend to send in cookies. If you run a load testing tool, if you don't stop and think about this, a lot of load testing tools by default won't send cookies. And so when you are, quote, testing your server for its ability to handle your load, you might not realize that because your load testing tool is not sending cookies, every request is creating a new session. And we've said this, but it's not just the creating the new session, it's what goes on in your session startup code. You might do nothing, or you might do lots. And that's where people sometimes are being burned. So now bring this all back to this. If 10% of your traffic is real people and 90% is automated stuff of whatever sort, you might have tremendous load doing things that if you reconsidered what you did in the app on session startup, you might not have as much load. Now, somebody, I'm sure, along the way here is wondering, well, wait, Charlie, you haven't talked about it. Can't you block requests with robots.txt? And we'll talk about that. Yes, there is a concept of robots.txt. It's a file, and you could just Google robots.txt, and there's a website called robotstext.org. And it's a general concept that all web servers and application servers support, where if you put such a file in place, let's say in your web root, you can identify whether you want spiders to go into your site at all, or whether they should only go to certain folders or they shouldn't go to certain folders. All that's controllable. And you can set it up for different user agents. I want to let Google do things, but I don't want to let Baidu do things, whatever makes sense for you. And all that's better than nothing. You could perhaps dramatically reduce impact by putting such robots text file in place. But it's a bit of a game of whack-a-mole, because you might anticipate ones that you want to allow in and then they change their user agent, or you say ones you want to block and you don't realize there's other ones you're not even thinking of that you want to block. So it's tough to do that. It's not
and that's only the well-behaved robots that even pay attention to it.
That's, if you could hear my tone of my voice, I was trying to get to that. Right, that's the second point. And everybody needs to understand this, is that the bad guys can lie. And they'll say they're Firefox, in the string that looks like Firefox. And your robot's text is gonna, it's gonna look at the user agent and it's gonna say, oh, they're not a spider. Or, let me tell you, it's up to the thing making the request to say whether to honor that robot's text. And the bad guy could just go, yeah, aren't you cute, robots text? I appreciate that you think that will protect you. I'm coming in anyway. Open the door. Let me in. And it just comes in and sends the request, because bad guys will tend to ignore that. It's just a standard that they are supposed to follow, and legit ones will. But, bad guys will go, yeah, cute, nice try. And boom.
I just want to share let them in. I just want to share a metaphor that you shared at Into the Box conference with me, that it's almost like your web server is like a fast food restaurant, and you're serving up hamburgers and fries and shakes to real customers, but then there are all these robots who are kind of crowding into your restaurant, and some of them are moderately well-behaved robots who read the robots.txt notice at the front door, but others are just kind of busting their way in there. And then you've got internal robots that are coming from inside the restaurant to check if your customer service quality is good every 5 seconds. Can I get a burger? Can I get a burger? and it's like crowding out the
Yes.
real
Right,
customers,
like
you know.
reviewers and what are those people that do shopping, anonymous shoppers? They try to check out how you're doing on customer service. Right. There's all kind of all the things like that. The analogies do really map to that. And so the bottom line is that people are often
and because you're a considerate, you know, restaurant owner, you decide that every time someone comes in the door, you're going to get a burger ready just in case they want to order it, because you want to give it to them quick, right? So now all your staff are rushing around getting these burgers ready for these phantom robot customers who never really actually pay and consume.
Yep. Or they may consume, but they don't pay. Exactly. Or you're doing this work and you don't care about them. Right. So there's all those analogies. And so that sets the table for the problem. And then in the remainder of the presentation, I talk about some possibilities for preventing that. And so we've already given a hint at one of them, which is you might want to revisit what you do in your session startup code. You might want to implement robots.txt. There are also tools out there that address this problem and try to look out for even the illegitimate ones, or they look for patterns of traffic that don't look legit, or they keep track heuristically across many servers that use a service, and they see that there's this common pattern, and they just say, hey, if we see this pattern, it's been identified as being bad by these people, we'll assume it's bad for you. So there are products like that, and they're implemented. The ones I'm thinking of right now are implemented as software as a service. So basically you would, I mean, there's different implementations. Some you implement in your physical environment. Some you implement as a hardware device, just like a load balancer or firewall can be on a hardware device. But then there's these others that for some people, it might make sense to consider. You don't change anything in your code. You don't change anything in your web server. You don't put a physical device into your environment. Instead, you just modify your DNS and you route your traffic to go through these services first. Think of it as like it's washing the traffic coming into you before it comes to you. So there are such services. Whoops. I'm not hearing you speak. So either you've gone.
I muted myself because there's like a brass band going down the street.
Oh, goodness.
Speaking of unexpected load, it's almost like what I was saying is, if using that restaurant analogy, these services are like a bouncer that at the front door checks whether people are real people or robots or naughty people, and decides who to let in before you even get overwhelmed by them.
Yep. And it's a bit hard to think about how to stretch that analogy to this, because it's the way to think of what I'm just talking about would be like, they've got to get on a bus and go through, border patrol before they come into your restaurant. And it could sound like that, but these things are all done very fast. So we're not talking about something that would be like, that would obviously take, minutes or hours. And so
what are some of these tools that do this?
And let me just say before I list them specifically that I'll mention this in the presentation, but I'll tell you now that I have a page on my site that lists all these things. So some of you have heard about it. It's called CFObjective.com for us old folks that used to remember using 411 as the way you called a phone to get information. But we'll talk about being old in a moment. But anyway, so CF411.com is a page I have that I've been keeping for 15 years. And it's got, a couple thousand tools and resources. And I break it into categories. And one of the categories is security protection tools. And within that category, I break it down at ColdFusion code level protection tools, and then web server level protection tools, and then firewall level protection tools, and then these service level protection tools. And so I have this category of these service, software as a service protection tools. And there's several of them. Cloudflare, Encapsula, Distill Networks, Security. So these are all in that space, and there's free versions of them, and then there's paid versions. And usually to get the web application firewall capabilities, you need to pay them. But some of them will help with denial of service for free. They'll watch for that kind of traffic and block it. Some will provide content delivery network capability, caching static images and stuff like that for free. So check them out. And again, go to that CF411, just do a find on security from the top down, and you'll find this section on security tools. And then I have security testing tools as well, 2 different sections. But anyway, so that's a possibility to implement such firewalls. And of course,
some of these are not just protecting, like Cloudflare, isn't that speeding up your site too? Or
by doing that CDN capability, right?
Yeah,
they stop traffic from really coming to your server by serving it up as a CDN. Yeah, so that's an implication of them. What I was going to say is that they also do protect you from many of these tools. They try to protect you from what might look like legitimate traffic, but it's attempts to break in. So SQL injection, cross-site scripting, all those different variations of vulnerabilities, these tools are also watching for that. And they will try to block that even from what looks to be legitimate people. But if they're trying to do naughty things, these tools will block those as well. And different tools offer different capabilities at different price points, and some are crazy expensive. But hey, some people might have important enough stuff that this is worth them paying $1,000 a month. Some of them might be $1,000 a month. You might have important enough stuff that that's worth it to get the protections that these things offer. So just check them out. That's my point, is that I can't help people know what's going to make sense for them unless we work interactively and really think it through. But I'm saying generically, everybody ought to look into these tools, be aware of them, be aware of the impact of this unexpected impact, and put in place any of the range of tools that either I talk about on the site or that I'll highlight in the presentation. So just come to the presentation and you'll hear a little bit more about each of these.
I'll add that link into the
Sure.
show notes for this episode so people can find it easy. But I do appreciate you having that CF411 set of resources. It's like a Wikipedia of ColdFusion stuff.
Yeah, directory. And again, it's an old school thing. It's a thing that people used to do years ago, and I started it years ago and have just kept it going. And I just update it all the time. I mean, another very popular one is people are often asking me where to find jobs, or they want to find people to do work. And rather than try to broker individuals, I just instead point people to a category there on the CF411 about jobs. So if you just go to cf411.com/CFjobs, it takes you right to this category I have of resources for finding CF jobs. And what I was going to say is that I know some people would go, oh, yeah, that's something you created 10 years ago and the thing doesn't work anymore, right? No, I keep up on a lot of these, the ones that are very popular. I keep up on them. And so just last month, I went through every one of the job resources and I identified how recently they had stuff and how many jobs they had that were CF jobs. And so there's about 7 or 8 different sites there that each in total, there's at least a couple hundred jobs. So don't let anybody tell you that there's no work. And then conversely, if you need help, don't believe that, you have to put it out on Monster and cross your fingers, or Career Builder, because, CF people may not be looking there, but CF people are looking at these other resources. And some of them are even Facebook groups where, you're getting more of a community feel and people will be helping each other out. And so, yeah, there's plenty of work, and there are people out there looking. And then, I had a blog post recently on how if you're looking for people, you can, of course, find a good developer in any language, and generally would not be difficult to get them to be able to quickly be capable at CFML. I realize some will say, but who's going to want to? Well, some people would be desperate enough that they'll take the time to learn something like that, because maybe you can offer them a good pay, or you can offer them the work where they want to be, or they're just burned out on PHP and they want to do something different. And hey, if they can pick it up quickly and easily, they'd be willing to try. And you might often find that sometimes you'll get better results from skilled developers that come from another platform because they bring better.
Yeah, and I know, I was talking to Luis Manejo at Order Solutions, and they do some of that. They find great developers. Because, the truth is, if you can program in 1 or 2 languages, you can program in a third.
And of course, people want to point out that we should, right? It's always in our interest to be capable of more than one thing. Sure. So we don't want to go down that road. Fortunately, this isn't a blog post. We're not going to have that big set of discussions in the chat. These are things that have been discussed over and over. And that leads well to our point that we were going to talk about perhaps in conclusion, was how, what goes around comes around, and there's nothing new under the sun. There are things that folks like Michael and I and several others in the community that are still here, that have been here for a long time. This is my 20th year. I started with CF in 97. And we were talking a bit before we got started about how, I know Michael for years has had resources he's put out. I've had resources I've put out. And it's lamentable that sometimes folks that are relatively new, whether we're talking about within a year or even perhaps 5 years or even 10 years, they sometimes don't think of looking at these old resources that might exist out there that someone like Michael or myself or any number of people, for instance, in the CF community or other technologies too. I see classic old SQL Server posts from years ago. And these days, most people learn stuff by having a particular problem and Googling it and hoping that Google finds them an answer. And sometimes you'll find, if you look closely, hey, man, that's an old answer. But Google says, well, enough people kept picking it that we're going to keep sending people to it because it seems to provide the answer. But what I was getting at and talking with Michael was that there are things that sometimes we who've used it for a while presume everybody knows because it was talked about a lot back when we got started. And now these days, a lot of this stuff isn't talked about anymore. And there's a lot of knowledge that's out there, but unless you are looking for it specifically, you don't find it. And the bummer is that we often do presume, well, doesn't everybody know X? And the truth is, no, everybody doesn't know X because they're so focused on solving a particular problem that they're often not leveraging these resources that it used to be we all saw. And it's all like another example is, and one of the next interview we'll do next week is on another talk I'll be doing on, and the title was What's New in CF 10, 11, and 2016 that you might have missed. And, some people, I've even gotten some comments, people saying, what's new in 10? What are you talking about? That's from 2012. I get it. It's what's new. We could say what is new or what was new. Let's not get caught up in semantics. The point is there's a lot of people who go, let's say, from 9 to 2016 or 9 to 11 or 10 to 2016. And to bring it back to what we're talking about now, I find that often people were not paying attention to the discussions that were taking place when a particular version came out. So let's say when 10 came out in 2012, for the half a year before it came